A 17-year-old honor student with a perfect GPA, early admission to MIT, and dreams of working for NASA, being dragged off an airplane like a common criminal. Her only crime? Sitting in the seat she'd paid for while being black in America. But when her 72-year-old grandfather stood up and uttered four simple words, the entire cabin fell silent. What those flight attendants discovered about this family would not only shock every passenger on that plane, but expose a truth about prejudice that runs deeper than anyone imagined. The aftermath of this confrontation would make national headlines and change airline policies forever. This is that story. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe now to support more stories about standing up against injustice. Meet Zara Williams, a remarkable 17-year-old from Atlanta, Georgia, whose bedroom walls told a story of academic excellence that most students could only dream of achieving. Every morning at 5:30, while her classmates were still sleeping, Zara would sit at her desk surrounded by advanced placement physics textbooks, calculus notebooks, and college acceptance letters that had been arriving since her junior year. The crown jewel among these achievements was a pristine white envelope bearing the Massachusetts Institute of Technology seal, an early admission acceptance letter that represented years of sacrifice, late-night studying, and unwavering determination. Zara had maintained a perfect 4.0 grade point average throughout high school while volunteering at the local science museum, tutoring younger students in mathematics, and conducting independent research on renewable energy sources. But today was different. Today, Zara was carefully folding her best interview outfit into a small suitcase, her hands trembling slightly with nervous excitement. She had been selected as one of only 12 high school students nationwide to interview for NASA's prestigious summer internship program, an opportunity that could launch her career in aerospace engineering before she even graduated high school. Her mother, Dr. Angela Williams, a pediatric surgeon at Emory University Hospital, had insisted on buying Zara a first-class ticket for this life-changing journey. "You've earned this moment, sweetheart," she had said while booking the flight. Travel in comfort and arrive confident. Zara possessed a rare combination of intellectual brilliance and genuine humility that made her beloved by teachers and respected by peers. She spoke softly but carried herself with quiet confidence, always treating others with kindness regardless of their background or circumstances. Her dream wasn't just personal success. She wanted to become an aerospace engineer to help develop sustainable space exploration technologies that could benefit all humanity. But what should have been the best day of her life was about to become her worst nightmare. Henry Williams had seen more history than most people read about in textbooks. At 72 years old, this distinguished gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses had spent 4 decades working for NASA during the most groundbreaking period in space exploration history. He had been there during the Apollo missions, working as a propulsion systems engineer when Neil Armstrong took those first steps on the moon. But Henry's journey to NASA hadn't been easy. In the 1960s and 70s, he had been one of only a handful of black engineers in a predominantly white organization. He had endured countless microaggressions, been passed over for promotions he deserved, and faced skepticism about his qualifications on a daily basis. Yet Henry had persevered with dignity, letting his exceptional work speak louder than the whispers of doubt that followed him through sterile hallways and conference rooms. He'd spent 40 years proving himself in rooms where he was the only one who looked like him, his colleagues would later say. Henry had developed a reputation for calm professionalism under pressure, earning respect through sheer competence and unwavering integrity. By the time he retired, he had contributed to 17 successful space missions and mentored dozens of young engineers. His relationship with Zara was extraordinarily close. As her grandfather, Henry had nurtured her love of science from an early age, spending countless hours explaining orbital mechanics, showing her NASA documentaries, and encouraging her to reach for the stars, literally. When Zara received the internship interview invitation, Henry had been more proud than when he'd received his own commendations from NASA leadership. The morning before Zara's departure, Henry had visited her family's home in Atlanta's affluent Buckhead neighborhood. He'd found his granddaughter in her room, surrounded by internship preparation materials and interview practice notes. "Remember, Zara," he had said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, "excellence recognizes excellence." Your knowledge and character will speak for themselves. What Henry didn't tell Zara was that he had quietly booked himself on the same flight, not because he didn't trust her independence, but because he understood the world in ways that her sheltered, privileged upbringing hadn't yet taught her. He had learned through decades of experience that sometimes even the most qualified person needs an advocate. Jackson Atlanta International Airport buzzed with its usual morning chaos as Zara arrived with her mother 2 hours before departure. The Delta Airlines first-class check-in counter processed her ticket without incident. A young professional traveler heading to Houston for business. Nothing unusual about that. Zara's boarding pass clearly indicated seat 2A, first-class window seat, with her full name printed in bold letters, Zara M. Williams. After an emotional goodbye with her mother, Zara made her way through security screening, where TSA agents process her documents efficiently. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to academic settings, dressed professionally in a navy blazer, white blouse, and black slacks that her mother had helped her select for the interview. At the gate, Zara settled into a corner seat and pulled out her tablet, reviewing NASA mission profiles and space exploration history. Other passengers began gathering, mostly business travelers in expensive suits, a few families with young children, and several elderly passengers heading to visit relatives. The demographic was predominantly white and affluent, typical for a weekday morning first-class section. When boarding began, Zara joined the priority line with her first-class ticket. The gate agent, a middle-aged white woman named Patricia Henderson, scanned Zara's boarding pass with professional efficiency. "Have a pleasant flight, Miss Williams," she said with a standard smile. Walking down the jet bridge, Zara felt a flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness. This was really happening. Her childhood dream of working for NASA was just one interview away from becoming reality. She had prepared extensively, researching current Mars exploration missions, studying the latest developments in ion propulsion technology, and practicing answers to potential questions about her academic background and career goals. The flight attendant greeting passengers at the aircraft door was Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old blonde woman who had been working for Delta for 6 years. Sarah had grown up in a small town outside Atlanta where diversity was limited, and despite company diversity training, she still harbored unconscious biases about who belonged in first-class seating. As Zara approached the entrance with her boarding pass ready, Sarah's expression subtly shifted. Her smile became slightly forced as she glanced from Zara's face to her ticket, then back again. "Welcome aboard," Sarah said, her tone just a degree cooler than it had been for previous passengers. Zara noticed the change, but attributed it to her own nervousness. She offered a warm smile and replied, "Thank you. I'm excited to fly with Delta today." Her genuine enthusiasm and polite demeanor should put any concerns to rest, but Sarah's discomfort was only beginning. That feeling was about to prove devastatingly accurate. Zara made her way to seat 2A, carefully stowing her carry-on bag in the overhead compartment before settling into the leather first-class seat. She pulled out her internship materials, a folder containing her research portfolio, letters of recommendation, and detailed notes about NASA's current projects. These documents represented months of preparation and clearly indicated the professional nature of her travel. The irony was unmistakable. Here was a young black woman carrying documentation that would impress NASA scientists, yet she was about to be treated as if she didn't belong on the airplane at all. Sarah Mitchell watched from the galley as Zara organized the materials. Instead of recognizing the obvious signs of a serious student preparing for an important interview, Sarah's biases caused her to interpret Zara's presence differently. In her mind, a 17-year-old black girl in first class didn't fit her preconceived notions of who typically occupied these seats. After completing the standard safety briefing, Sarah approached Zara's row with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me, miss," she said, her tone artificially sweet but carrying an underlying tension. "I think there might be a mistake with your seating assignment." Zara looked up from her NASA research notes, genuinely confused. She had checked her boarding pass multiple times and knew she was in the correct seat. "I'm sorry, is there a problem?" she asked politely, reaching for her boarding pass. "This is seat 2A, and that's what my ticket says." Sarah glanced at the boarding pass but didn't really examine it carefully. Instead, she continued with her assumption-based approach. Well, sometimes a computer system makes errors with upgrades and special bookings. I'm going to need to see some additional identification to verify that this seat assignment is correct. The request was highly unusual and completely against standard airline procedures. Passengers are never asked to provide additional identification after boarding unless there are serious security concerns or documentation discrepancies. Zara had already been processed through multiple checkpoints, ticket counter, security screening, gate boarding, and her identification had been verified at each stage. But Zara, raised to be respectful to authority figures, complied without argument. She reached into her purse and produced her driver's license, student ID from her high school, and even her early admission letter from MIT. "Here's my identification," she said calmly. "And this letter shows why I'm traveling. I have an interview with NASA tomorrow." Sarah barely glanced at the MIT acceptance letter, a document that should have immediately commanded respect and ended any questions about Zara's credibility. Instead, she seemed more focused on finding reasons to doubt rather than evidence to confirm. "I'm still not comfortable with this situation," Sarah said, her voice growing firmer. "I think we need to sort this out before takeoff." Other first-class passengers were beginning to notice the interaction. Some watched with curious interest. Others appeared uncomfortable with the obvious tension developing. A businessman in seat 1C, Marcus Thompson, couldn't help but observe that the flight attendant was treating this obviously intelligent young woman with suspicion that seemed completely unwarranted. Zara felt her cheeks growing warm with embarrassment, but she maintained her composure. Years of being with a few black students in advanced placement classes had taught her to navigate these situations with dignity. "Ma'am, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have, but I'm not sure what the problem is. My ticket is valid, my identification matches, and I provided additional documentation showing the purpose of my travel." The situation was rapidly spiraling beyond Sarah Mitchell's control, but instead of stepping back and reassessing her assumptions, she doubled down on her misguided suspicions. She signaled to her colleague, Rebecca Stone, a senior flight attendant with 15 years of experience who should have known better. Rebecca approached the scene with the confidence of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations, but she made the critical error of trusting Sarah's judgment rather than independently evaluating the circumstances. The two flight attendants huddled together near the galley, speaking in whispers while glancing repeatedly at Zara. "She seems nervous," Sarah whispered to Rebecca, completely misreading Zara's natural excitement about her upcoming interview as suspicious behavior. "And it's unusual for someone her age to be traveling alone in first class. Something doesn't feel right." Rebecca, despite her experience, fell into the same trap of racial profiling that had ensnared her colleague. Instead of recognizing that young people sometimes travel first class for important reasons, interviews, family emergencies, or simply because their families could afford it, she allowed implicit bias to cloud her professional judgment. The whispered conversation between the flight attendants was creating a spectacle that other passengers couldn't ignore. Marcus Thompson, the businessman in seat 1C, found himself increasingly uncomfortable with what he was witnessing. As a black executive who had experienced his own share of discrimination, he recognized a familiar pattern of assumptions and suspicions that seemed to follow successful black individuals into spaces where they were deemed not to belong. Rebecca returned to Zara's seat with Sarah, both women now presenting a united front that felt more like an interrogation than customer service. "Miss, we're going to need you to explain exactly why you're traveling today and how you came to have a first-class ticket," Rebecca said with authoritative firmness. The question was inappropriate, invasive, and completely outside the bounds of normal airline procedures. Passengers are never required to justify their travel purposes or explain how they acquired their tickets unless there are legitimate security or fraud concerns. Zara's documentation was clearly in order, yet she was being treated as if she were guilty of something undefined. Zara felt a surge of frustration but fought to maintain her composure. She had been raised by parents who taught her that responding to discrimination with anger would only reinforce negative stereotypes. "As I mentioned, I'm traveling to Houston for an interview with NASA's internship program," she explained patiently. "My mother purchased this ticket because she wanted me to be comfortable for this important trip." "NASA internship?" Sarah said with barely concealed skepticism. That seems like quite a story for someone your age. The dismissive tone was a final straw from Marcus Thompson, who could no longer remain silent. "Excuse me," he interjected from his seat, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to corporate boardrooms. "I couldn't help but notice that you're questioning this young lady's credentials and travel purpose. She's shown you multiple forms of identification and documentation. What exactly is the problem here?" Sarah and Rebecca were taken aback by the passenger intervention, but instead of recognizing it as a sign that their behavior was inappropriate, they became defensive. "Sir, this is airline business and doesn't concern other passengers," Rebecca replied curtly. "We have protocols to follow for passenger safety and security." Marcus wasn't intimidated. "I travel frequently for business, and I've never seen passengers question like this after they've already boarded and taken their assigned seats. This young woman has been nothing but polite and cooperative, yet you're treating her like a security threat." His words carried weight because they were obviously true. Zara had done nothing suspicious, disruptive, or inappropriate. She had boarded normally, taken her assigned seat, and produced all requested documentation. The only thing that made her different from other first-class passengers was her race and age. But the flight attendants were now committed to their course of action, perhaps feeling that backing down would be an admission of wrongdoing. "We appreciate your concern, sir," Rebecca said with forced professionalism, "but we need to ensure that all passengers are properly documented and authorized to be in their seating assignments." What happened next would change everything. The decision to call security was a point of no return, a moment that would transform an embarrassing case of profiling into a viral incident with national implications. Rebecca Stone made the fateful choice to contact the captain and request ground security assistance, claiming there was a seating dispute that required resolution. Captain William Hayes, a 22-year veteran pilot with Delta Airlines, was preparing for takeoff when he received the unusual request. In his extensive career, he had rarely encountered seating disputes that required security intervention, especially after passengers had already boarded and settled into their assigned seats. But he trusted his crew's judgment and authorized a security request. Airport security officers James Rodriguez and Patricia Clark received the call and boarded the aircraft within minutes. Both officers were experienced professionals who had handled countless passenger disputes, but they were immediately struck by the unusual nature of this particular situation. They found a well-dressed teenage girl sitting quietly in her assigned seat, surrounded by obvious academic materials, being accused of what exactly? What seems to be the problem here? Officer Rodriguez asked, his trained eye taking in the scene and finding nothing that resembled a typical security concern. Rebecca Stone launched into an explanation that revealed the weakness of their position. "This passenger's documentation doesn't seem appropriate for her seating assignment, and we have concerns about whether she's authorized to be in first class." Officer Rodriguez examined Zara's boarding pass, driver's license, and MIT acceptance letter. As a security professional trained to identify fraudulent documents and suspicious behavior, he found nothing concerning about any of Zara's documentation. Everything was legitimate, properly formatted, and consistent with her stated travel purpose. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said to Rebecca, "these documents appear to be completely in order. The passenger has a valid first-class ticket, proper identification, and documentation supporting her travel purpose. I'm not seeing any security concerns here." But the situation had gained its own momentum. Other passengers were now openly watching and recording the incident on their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something significant. A family traveling with young children in seats 3A and 3B looked visibly uncomfortable as they watched the teenager being treated like a criminal for sitting in her assigned seat. Sarah Mitchell, perhaps realizing that the situation was spiraling out of control but unable to admit error, made one final attempt to justify their actions. "We're just following airline policy to ensure passenger safety and proper seating assignments," she said, her voice betraying her own uncertainty. "What specific airline policy requires passengers to justify their presence in seats they've legitimately purchased?" asked Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a psychology professor traveling in seat 4A who couldn't remain silent. "I've been flying for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this." The question hung in the air because there was no such policy. What was happening to Zara was not standard procedure, airline protocol, or security practice. It was racial profiling, pure and simple, dressed up in official-sounding language about safety and verification. Zara, who had maintained her composure throughout the ordeal, finally spoke up with quiet dignity that would later be praised by millions of viewers. "Officers, I understand that you're doing your job, but I haven't done anything wrong. I bought this ticket legitimately. I've shown you all my documentation, and I'm just trying to get to Houston for the most important interview of my life. I don't understand why I'm being treated this way." Her words carried such genuine confusion and hurt that even security officers seemed uncomfortable with the situation they'd been called to resolve. Officer Clark, a mother of 2 teenagers herself, looked at Zara and saw her own daughter, a bright, ambitious young person, being humiliated for reasons that had nothing to do with actual wrongdoing. But Zara wasn't alone on this flight. From seat 24B in the economy section, Henry Williams had been listening to the commotion in first class with growing alarm and recognition. The voices carried clearly through the aircraft cabin, and what he heard transported him back to countless similar situations he'd experienced throughout his career at NASA. The tone, the assumptions, the barely concealed skepticism about a black person's right to be in a particular space. It was all painfully familiar. Henry had specifically chosen not to tell Zara about his presence on the flight. He wanted her to have independence and confidence in handling this important trip on her own. But it also learned through decades of experience that sometimes even the most qualified person needs an ally. His decision to book a seat on the same flight had been motivated by protective instinct rather than lack of faith in his granddaughter's abilities. Now, listening to his beloved granddaughter being interrogated and humiliated, Henry felt the familiar surge of controlled anger that had sustained him through 40 years of fighting discrimination in the aerospace industry. But Henry Williams was not a man who acted on emotion. He was strategic, thoughtful, and devastatingly effective when he chose to engage. Rising slowly from his economy seat, Henry made his way toward the front of the aircraft with the measured pace of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of rocket scientists and NASA administrators. At 72, he still carried himself with a dignified bearing that had earned him respect in the most challenging professional environments. "Excuse me," Henry said in a voice that carried natural authority, "but I couldn't help overhearing this conversation. What exactly is happening here?" Rebecca Stone barely glanced at the elderly black man approaching from economy class, assuming he was simply another passenger inserting himself into airline business. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. Please return to your seat so we can resolve this matter." "Actually," Henry said with calm precision, "it does concern me very much. That young lady you're questioning is my granddaughter, and I'd like to know why she's being removed from a seat she legitimately purchased." The revelation hit the cabin like a thunderbolt. Zara's eyes widened in shock and relief as she saw her grandfather walking toward her with that familiar expression of protective determination. "Granddad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what are you doing here?" Henry's presence immediately changed the dynamic of the situation. Here was an elderly gentleman with obvious dignity and intelligence, clearly related to the young woman in question, completely contradicting any assumptions about Zara being an unaccompanied minor or someone without family connections. But more importantly, Henry Williams possessed something that would soon become apparent, the kind of credentials and experience that could not be dismissed or questioned. As he approached his granddaughter's seat, several passengers noticed a small NASA pin on his jacket lapel, a detail that would prove more significant than anyone could imagine. "I'm here because I was concerned about my granddaughter traveling alone for such an important interview," Henry explained to the watching passengers. "I wanted to be nearby in case she needed support. I never imagined she would need protection from airline staff." What Granddad said next left the entire plane speechless. Sarah Mitchell, still clinging to her misguided assumptions, looked dismissively at Henry Williams. In her limited worldview, she saw an elderly black man from economy class who was simply trying to help his granddaughter avoid consequences for whatever rules she assumed had been broken. "Sir, I understand your concern about your granddaughter, but we're following airline procedures here. She needs to provide appropriate documentation for her first-class seating assignment," Sarah said with condescending patience. Henry's response was delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades proving his qualifications to skeptical audiences. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a leather wallet, speaking 4 words that would completely transform the situation. "I work for NASA." The effect was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones that had been recording were held more steadily, and every person in the first-class cabin turned their full attention to this distinguished gentleman who had just claimed affiliation with America's premier space agency. But Henry wasn't finished. With the same deliberate pace that had characterized his approach to complex engineering problems, he continued his revelation. "Actually, let me be more precise. I worked for NASA for 40 years. I was a propulsion systems engineer who contributed to 17 successful space missions, including several Apollo program launches." He withdrew a NASA retiree identification card, his agency service pin, and a letter of commendation signed by a former NASA administrator. The documentation was impressive enough, but Henry's calm, authoritative delivery made it clear that this was not someone who needed to exaggerate or embellish his accomplishments. Rebecca Stone's face went pale as she began to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Not only had they been harassing an innocent passenger, but they had been questioning the granddaughter of a NASA veteran, someone whose contributions to American space exploration were documented and undeniable. "My granddaughter," Henry continued with measured emphasis, "is flying to Houston tomorrow to interview for the same NASA internship program that I helped establish 30 years ago. She has maintained a perfect grade point average throughout high school, earned early admission to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and has been selected as one of only 12 students nationwide to participate in this interview process." She would later write about implicit bias and the power of credentials to overcome prejudice. This was a textbook example of how discrimination operates until confronted with undeniable evidence of merit. Furthermore, Henry said, producing a folder from his carry-on bag, "Here's the official NASA correspondence inviting Zara to this interview, along with her research portfolio that was submitted as part of the selection process. Perhaps you'd like to review her work on ion propulsion efficiency and sustainable spacecraft design." But he wasn't done. Henry Williams had spent 4 decades learning how to navigate professional environments where his competence was questioned before he even spoke a word. He understood that in situations like this, partial revelations were insufficient. He needed to present evidence so comprehensive and undeniable that no room remained for doubt or dismissal. "I want everyone on this aircraft to understand something," Henry said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to addressing rooms full of rocket scientists and NASA administrators. "My granddaughter isn't just any 17-year-old traveling to Houston. She is quite possibly one of the most academically accomplished young people in the state of Georgia." He began systematically presenting documentation that painted a picture of extraordinary achievement. Zara's high school transcript showing perfect grades in advanced placement physics, calculus, chemistry, and computer science. Letters of recommendation from professors at Georgia Institute of Technology, where she had taken summer courses. Research papers she had presented at state science fairs, including one on renewable energy applications in space exploration that had earned recognition from the American Aerospace Society. "This young woman," Henry continued, his pride evident but controlled, "has spent the last 4 years preparing for exactly this opportunity. She has sacrificed social activities, worked part-time jobs to fund her research projects and maintain academic excellence while volunteering to tutor younger students in mathematics and science." The contrast between Zara's actual accomplishments and the assumptions that had led to her harassment was becoming painfully obvious to everyone in the cabin. Here was documentary evidence of exceptional merit being presented by a man whose own credentials were beyond question. But Henry saved his most powerful revelation for last. The NASA internship program that invited Zara to interview? I didn't just contribute to its establishment. I designed the selection criteria specifically to identify young people with their combination of academic excellence, research potential, and commitment to advancing human knowledge through space exploration. The irony was devastating. The flight attendants had been questioning whether Zara belonged in a first-class seat, while she was actually traveling to an interview for a program created by her own grandfather, a man who had helped put humans on the moon. Captain William Hayes, who had been listening to the exchange to the cockpit door, finally emerged to address the situation personally. As a pilot with over 2 decades of experience, he had learned to recognize when his crew had made serious errors in judgment. This was clearly one of those moments. "Mr. Williams," Captain Hayes said with appropriate respect, "I want to personally apologize for this incident. Your granddaughter should never have been questioned about her right to occupy the seat she legitimately purchased. This is not representative of Delta Airlines' values or policies." The flight crew's response would shock everyone. The apology from Captain Hayes marked the beginning of what corporate crisis management experts would later describe as a textbook example of how not to handle discrimination incidents. Rather than immediately de-escalating the situation and implementing corrective measures, the airline's response became a series of defensive moves that only deepened the crisis. Rebecca Stone, realizing that her career was potentially on the line, began attempting to reframe the incident as a simple misunderstanding rather than acknowledging the clear pattern of racial profiling that had occurred. "Captain, we were simply following standard security protocols to verify passenger documentation. There was no intent to discriminate against anyone." Henry Williams had encountered this type of defensive response countless times throughout his NASA career. The refusal to acknowledge obvious bias even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. His response was measured but devastating in its precision. "Ms. Stone, I've spent 40 years working in environments where my qualifications were questioned based on assumptions about who belongs in certain spaces. I recognize the pattern of behavior I've witnessed here today. This was not standard security protocol. This was profiling based on age and race." The security officers, James Rodriguez and Patricia Clark, were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with their role in the situation. As trained professionals, they could clearly see that no legitimate security concerns existed and that they had been called to resolve a problem that should never have occurred. "Sir," Officer Rodriguez said to Captain Hayes, "I need to point out that this passenger's documentation was completely appropriate from the moment we boarded the aircraft. There were no security concerns, no policy violations, and no legitimate reasons for the questioning that occurred." His statement carried significant weight because security officers are trained to identify genuine threats and suspicious behavior. When law enforcement professionals explicitly state that no concerns existed, it becomes impossible to maintain that airline procedures were being properly followed. Sarah Mitchell, perhaps recognizing that her initial assumptions had created this crisis, made one final attempt to justify her actions. "We've had issues in the past with passengers who couldn't provide appropriate documentation for premium seating assignments. We were just being thorough." Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the psychology professor, could no longer remain silent in the face of such obvious rationalization. "What you're describing doesn't match what I observed." This young woman provided multiple forms of identification, travel documentation, and academic credentials. She was questioned not because of missing documentation, but because someone made assumptions about who belongs in first-class seating. Her academic analysis was supported by the obvious evidence that other passengers had observed. No one had seen Zara behave suspiciously, fail to provide requested documentation, or violate any airline policies. The only thing that had made her different from other first-class passengers was her demographic profile. Marcus Thompson, who had earlier challenged the flight attendants, added his corporate perspective. "In my 20 years of business travel, I've never seen a passenger treated this way after providing valid tickets and identification. What I witnessed was unprofessional, inappropriate, and clearly discriminatory. But the damage was already done. What happened next demonstrated the power of collective witness and moral courage in the face of obvious injustice." Creating a chorus of support for Zara and condemnation of the airline's behavior. The first to stand was Dr. Maria Santos, a pediatric surgeon traveling to a medical conference in Houston. As a Latina professional who had experienced her own share of discrimination, she recognized the familiar dynamics of prejudice and felt compelled to add her voice to the growing protests. "I watched this entire incident unfold," Dr. Santos said with professional authority. "This young woman was treated disgracefully, and every passenger on this aircraft witnessed it. She was polite, cooperative, and provided extensive documentation that clearly established her credentials and travel purpose." Her statement was particularly powerful because medical professionals are widely respected for their judgment and credibility. When a doctor explicitly describes behavior as discriminatory, It carries significant weight with both airline officials and other passengers. The family traveling with children in seats 3A and 3B, David and Susan Morrison with their 2 teenagers, added their perspective as parents who were horrified by what their children had witnessed. "My kids were watching this whole thing," Susan Morrison said with visible emotion. "How do I explain to them why a student with perfect grades and early admission to MIT was treated like a criminal? What message does this send about fairness and equal treatment?" Her husband, David, a small business owner from Dallas, was equally disturbed. "If this happened to our daughter when she traveled for college interviews next year, we would be devastated. No young person should have to endure this kind of humiliation for sitting in a seat they legitimately purchased." The moral authority of parents protecting not just their own children, but all children was particularly compelling. Their outrage transcended racial lines and spoke to fundamental values about how young people should be treated when pursuing educational opportunities. Even passengers who might not have initially recognized the discriminatory nature of the incident were being educated by the testimony of their fellow travelers. Margaret Chun, an elderly passenger traveling to visit her grandchildren, found herself comparing Zara's treatment to her own family's experiences. "My granddaughter is about the same age as this young lady," Mrs. Chin said softly. "She travels for her academic competitions and has never been questioned the way I witnessed today. The only difference I can see is the color of their skin, and that breaks my heart." What happened next would make national news. Captain William Hayes found himself in an impossible position that would define the remainder of his career. As the ultimate authority on the aircraft, he had the power to make decisions that could either mitigate the crisis or escalate it further. His next choices would be scrutinized by airline executives, federal regulators, civil rights organizations, and millions of social media users. The immediate challenge was operational. The flight was already delayed, passengers were clearly upset, and the cabin atmosphere had become charged with tension that could affect flight safety. But the deeper challenge was moral. How does a leader respond when confronted with clear evidence that his subordinates have engaged in discriminatory behavior? Captain Hayes had been flying for Delta Airlines for 22 years and had built a reputation as a professional pilot who handled difficult situations with calm competence. He had dealt with medical emergencies, severe weather, mechanical failures, and unruly passengers. But he had never encountered a situation quite like this, where his own crew had created a crisis through their inappropriate actions. His first decision was pragmatic. He needed to de-escalate the immediate tension in the cabin so that the flight could proceed safely. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced over the aircraft's public address system, "I want to personally apologize for the delay and the inappropriate treatment that Ms. Williams experienced. This is not representative of Delta Airlines' values or standard operating procedures." But the apology, while necessary, was insufficient to address the deeper issues that passengers were demanding be confronted. Several travelers were already posting updates on social media platforms, and the incident was beginning to attract attention beyond the aircraft cabin. James Wilson, a technology executive traveling in Seat 1A, had been live streaming portions of the incident on his company's social media account, which had over 50,000 followers. His real-time commentary was already generating hundreds of comments and shares, transforming a single flight incident into a viral moment with national implications. "This is exactly the kind of systematic discrimination that we need to confront as society," Wilson said into his phone camera while live streaming. "I'm watching a brilliant young woman being harassed for the crime of being black and successful. Her grandfather is a NASA engineer who helped put humans on the moon, and she's interviewing for an internship program he created. The irony is devastating." The social media posts were creating external pressure that Captain Hayes couldn't ignore. Delta Airlines' corporate communications team was already receiving inquiries from journalists, civil rights organizations, and federal transportation officials who had been alerted to the incident through viral posts and passenger complaints. Rebecca Stone approached the captain with visible anxiety about the escalating situation. "Captain, perhaps we should ask the passengers to stop recording and posting on social media. This could become a public relations nightmare for the airline." Her suggestion revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of both the legal and practical realities of the situation. Passengers have every right to document incidents on commercial flights, especially when those incidents involve potential civil rights violations. More importantly, attempting to suppress recording and social media posting would only confirm that the airline had something to hide. Henry Williams, who had remained strategically quiet while passengers expressed their outrage, chose this moment to provide Captain Hayes with a face-saving path forward. Captain, I understand that you're dealing with a difficult situation created by your crew's poor judgment. As someone who spent decades managing complex projects at NASA, I know that leadership involves acknowledging mistakes and implementing corrective action. His offer of diplomatic resolution was generous considering the circumstances, but it came with implicit expectations about how the airline would demonstrate accountability. Henry had learned through 4 decades of experience that meaningful change requires more than apologies. It demands concrete actions and systemic reforms. But the real lesson was to address the passengers directly, not to escalate the situation further, but to provide perspective that could help heal the wounds created by discrimination and prejudice. Ladies and gentlemen, Henry began with the same calm authority he had used to address NASA engineers and administrators throughout his career. I want to thank you for supporting my granddaughter during this difficult experience. Your willingness to speak up against injustice demonstrates the best of humanity. His words carried weight not just because of his NASA credentials, but because passengers had witnessed his measured response to a situation that would have justified anger or outrage. Instead of attacking the airline staff personally, Henry had systematically dismantled their assumptions with facts, documentation, and professional dignity. I've lived through 7 decades of American history, including the civil rights movement, the space race, and countless moments when this country had to choose between its ideals and its prejudices. What I've learned is that progress comes not through anger or revenge, but through education, understanding, and the courage to demand better from ourselves and our institutions. Zara, who had remained composed throughout the ordeal, finally began to show the emotional impact of what she had experienced. Tears welled in her eyes as she listened to her grandfather transform her humiliation into a lesson about resilience and hope. She had inherited his strength, but she was still 17 years old, and the weight of being scrutinized and doubted because of her race was overwhelming. "Granddad," she said softly, "how do you keep believing in people when they keep disappointing you? How did you survive 40 years of having to prove yourself over and over again?" Henry's response would later be quoted in articles, academic papers, and social media posts about overcoming discrimination through excellence and perseverance. "Sweetheart, I survived by understanding that other people's limitations are not my limitations. Their inability to see my worth didn't diminish my value. It revealed their blindness." He turned to address the broader cabin, including the flight attendants who had created this crisis. "The young woman you questioned today represents the future of American space exploration. She has the intelligence, dedication, and character to contribute to missions that will take humanity to Mars and beyond. Your assumptions about who she is or what she's capable of don't change those facts." His next words would change how Zara saw everything. Henry Williams had waited for this moment throughout Zara's childhood, not the specific incident of discrimination, which he had hoped she might never experience, but the opportunity to share the hard-won wisdom that had sustained him through decades of professional and personal challenges. "Zara, I want you to understand something that took me years to learn," Henry said, his voice carrying the weight of experience and love. "Excellence is not just about achieving your goals. It's about maintaining your dignity and character when others try to diminish you." He began sharing stories from his own career that he had never told his granddaughter, wanting to shield her from the harsh realities of discrimination until she was mature enough to process them constructively. Now, faced with her own encounter with prejudice, he knew the time had come for complete honesty. "When I started at NASA in 1965, I was one of only 3 black engineers in facility with over 2,000 employees. Every day, I had to prove that I belonged there. Colleagues would question my calculations. Supervisors would double-check my work, and some people assumed I had been hired to fill quotas rather than because of my qualifications." The parallel to Zara's experience was obvious and painful. 57 years after her grandfather had faced similar assumptions at NASA, she was being questioned about her right to sit in an airplane seat she had legitimately purchased for a NASA interview. "But here's what I discovered," Henry continued, his voice growing stronger. "Every time someone doubted my abilities, it motivated me to work harder, study more, and produce results that were undeniably excellent. By the time I retired, I had contributed to more successful space missions than most of my colleagues, regardless of race. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the psychology professor, was taking mental notes for the research paper she was already planning to write about this incident. Here was a real-time example of how individuals develop resilience in the face of systematic discrimination, not by accepting injustice, but by refusing to let it define their self-worth or limit their achievements. The NASA internship program that invited you to interview exists because I and others like me persevered through exactly these kinds of challenges. Henry told Zara, every barrier we broke down, every assumption we disproved, every mission we helped succeed, it all contributed to creating opportunities for the next generation. For you, Marcus Thompson, who had been the first passenger to challenge the flight attendant's behavior, found himself deeply moved by Henry's words. As a successful black executive, he recognized the familiar strategy of responding to discrimination through excellence rather than anger. It was a burden that shouldn't exist, but it was also a source of strength that had propelled countless individuals to extraordinary achievements. What happened to you today was wrong, Henry said directly to Zara. But how you respond to it would define your character and determine your future success. You can choose to be bitter, or you can choose to be better. I recommend choosing better. What Zara decided to do next surprised everyone. The moment that followed Henry's words would later be described by passengers as transformative. A young woman transitioned from victim to advocate, from humiliation to empowerment. Zara Williams, who had spent the last hour being questioned and doubted, stood up with composure that belied her 17 years and addressed the cabin full of strangers who had become witnesses to her ordeal. I want to thank everyone who spoke up for me today, Zara began, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the situation. Your support meant everything to me, and it showed me that there are still people willing to stand up against injustice when they see it. Her words carried a maturity that impressed even the adults who had been defending her. Here was a teenager who had just experienced public humiliation, yet she was expressing gratitude rather than anger, grace rather than grievance. But I also want you to know that this experience, as painful as it was, won't stop me from pursuing my dreams, Zara continued. Tomorrow, I'm going to walk into that NASA interview with confidence, knowing that I've earned my place there through hard work, dedication, and the love and support of family members like my grandfather who paved the way for me. Sarah Mitchell and Rebecca Stone, the flight attendants whose assumptions had created this crisis, were visibly emotional as they listened to Zara's response. Began to understand the full impact of their behavior, not just the immediate harm to Zara, but the broader implications about assumptions, prejudice, and the damage that occurs when people are judged by demographics rather than character. I forgive the flight crew for what happened, Zara said, her words surprising everyone including her grandfather. I don't think they intended to be discriminatory, but I hope they'll use this experience to examine their own biases and treat future passengers with the respect that everyone deserves. Her decision to offer forgiveness rather than condemnation demonstrated a level of emotional intelligence and moral courage that impressed every passenger on the aircraft. She had transformed a moment of victimization into an opportunity for education and healing. Dr. Maria Santos, the pediatric surgeon, found herself thinking about her own teenage patients who faced discrimination in healthcare settings. Zara's response provided a powerful model for how young people can maintain their dignity and self-worth even when confronted with unfair treatment. I also want to say something to any young people who might eventually see this story, Zara added, acknowledging the social media coverage that was already making her experience public. Don't let other people's limitations become your limitations. Don't let their assumptions about who you are prevent you from becoming who you're meant to be. Captain Hayes, who had been struggling with how to conclude this unprecedented situation, found a solution in Zara's remarkable demonstration of maturity and forgiveness. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can all learn something from Ms. Williams' response to this incident. Her grace under pressure and commitment to her goals despite facing discrimination exemplify the best of human character. But the story doesn't end there. As Delta Flight 1247 finally prepared for takeoff after a 2-hour delay, the atmosphere in the cabin had been completely transformed. What had begun as a routine morning flight had become a shared experience that would connect these passengers forever. The incident had created an unexpected community of witnesses who had collectively confronted discrimination and supported justice. The flight to Houston proceeded without further incident, but the impact of what had occurred continued to reverberate through social media, news outlets, and corporate boardrooms. James Wilson's live stream coverage had been viewed over 200,000 times within the first hour, generating thousands of comments and shares that amplified Zara's story across multiple platforms. Delta Airlines corporate headquarters in Atlanta was already implementing crisis management protocols as executives realized that this incident could become a defining moment for the company's reputation regarding diversity and inclusion. The live streamed footage and passenger testimony provided undeniable evidence of what had occurred, making denial or minimization impossible. Upon landing in Houston, Zara was greeted by NASA officials who had been alerted to the incident through social media coverage and passenger complaints to the airline. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, the director of the internship program that Henry Williams had helped create 30 years earlier, was waiting at the gate with a small delegation of NASA representatives. "Ms. Williams," Dr. Rodriguez said warmly, "we want you to know that NASA stands behind you completely. What happened on this flight does not reflect our values or our commitment to supporting promising young scientists and engineers regardless of their background." The NASA officials had reviewed Zara's research portfolio during the flight and were already impressed by her academic achievements and research potential. The grace and maturity she had demonstrated in responding to discrimination only reinforced their conviction that she represented exactly the kind of character and intelligence NASA sought in its future leaders. Henry Williams watched with pride as his granddaughter was welcomed by NASA officials, but he also felt the familiar weight of knowing that this victory came at the cost of having to prove her worth under circumstances that white students would never face. Progress was being made, but the burden of representation remained heavy on young shoulders. The national response would exceed everyone's expectations. Within 24 hours, hashtag Zara Williams essay had become a trending topic across social media platforms, generating millions of views, shares, and comments from people around the world who were inspired by her story and outraged by the discrimination she had experienced. The incident became a catalyst for broader conversations about implicit bias, educational opportunity, and the persistence of discrimination in modern America. NASA leveraged viral attention to launch a new scholarship program specifically designed to support underrepresented students pursuing careers in aerospace engineering and space exploration. The Williams Family Scholarship, named in honor of both Henry and Zara Williams, will provide full funding for college education and guaranteed internship opportunities for students who demonstrated both academic excellence and the character to overcome adversity. Delta Airlines, facing intense public scrutiny and potential federal investigation, implemented comprehensive changes to their passenger service policies and employee training programs. The incident forced the airline to confront the reality that implicit bias training was insufficient. They needed systemic reforms that would prevent discrimination and ensure accountability when it occurred. Sarah Mitchell and Rebecca Stone, the flight attendants whose assumptions had created the crisis, were suspended pending investigation and required to complete extensive diversity training before being allowed to return to duty. Both women publicly apologized to Zara and her family, acknowledging that their behavior had been inappropriate and discriminatory. But the most significant impact was on Zara herself. The teenager who had been humiliated for sitting in a first-class seat became a powerful voice for educational equity and social justice. Her NASA internship, which she completed with distinction, led early admission not just MIT, but to several other prestigious universities that competed to recruit her. More importantly, Zara's story inspired countless other young people who saw in her experience both the persistence of discrimination and the possibility of overcoming it through excellence, dignity, and the support of allies willing to speak up against injustice. 2 years later, when Zara gave a commencement address at her high school graduation, she would return to the lesson her grandfather had taught her on that difficult flight. Excellence is not just about achieving your goals. It's about maintaining your dignity and character when others try to diminish you. Her final words to the camera, spoken directly to viewers who had followed her journey from discrimination victim to NASA intern to inspirational speaker, carried the wisdom of someone who had learned early that other people's limitations need not become her own. Don't let anyone else's assumptions about who you are prevent you from becoming who you're meant to be. The sky is not the limit. It's just the beginning. Viewers were left with a powerful reminder that individual acts of courage and collective willingness to confront injustice can transform not just personal trajectories, but entire systems and societies. Zara Williams' story had begun with discrimination at 30,000 feet, but ended with her reaching for the stars. What would you have done in this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about courage, perseverance, and the power of standing up for what's right.